Well, good afternoon and welcome to our fourth installment of our Creating Success with Market Steers and Breeding Beef Heifers. We're glad you're here with us this afternoon. We got a good group. Our moderator today is going to be Kelly Ranley. She's online with us and she'll be fielding your questions and relaying to us to them. I'm Dr. Jason Clear and I'm assistant professor or associate professor and extension beef cattle specialist here at Texas A&M University. And I work for Texas A&M AgriLife Extension and primarily work with ranchers and supporting their efforts across the state of Texas. But then I also get the opportunity to do some youth type activities and work with 4-H and FFA just like we are right now. And so it's a pleasure to be here today. This program was created with a couple of groups of county extension agents that are part of the East Texas Show Star Series, which is a workshop in the fall in the eastern portion of the state, and then also the Southern Classic, which is a workshop that's held in the Brazos Valley every year in the fall for youth to come and bring their projects and exhibit them and go through workshops as well. So we're glad to have you here today. Again, if you've got some questions, this week we're specifically addressing nutrition on both today as well as Thursday at 3. Today we're going to focus on more of the feed and the rations and just give you an introduction into that and what we feed these cattle. But then when we move into Thursday, we're going to talk about, well, how do you read your cattle from the perspective of, how much are they gaining? How much condition are those heifers putting on? Are your market steers gaining? And talk to you a little bit about managing that side, the animal side of it as well. But today we're going to focus on the feed and feeding these projects. When we think about feeding and nutrition, oftentimes everybody asks me, well, what's the secret of your success and your boys' success of your projects, and how do you get your heifers in the right condition and your steers to gain weight, and your boys have been successful with their projects, and how do you do it? What's your secret? Well, there's no secret to it, as we discussed in our introduction. Really, it comes down to genetics. It comes down to, and genetics are about 40% of the project. Nutrition is about 30% of the project. And then as far as the day-to-day management is another 20%. And then you've got the luck on the end of it. That's just a small percentage of it. But nutrition is extremely important. And today we're here at the Clear Family Barn where my sons keep their projects, and this is on our place in Madisonville, Texas, and we're in the feed room. And for me and my boys, when we think about the success of their project, I think this is probably where most of it occurs, is right here in this particular room, where all the feed's mixed, where the feed's stored, and where everything that these animals get is going to come from this particular room right here. And it's important from a feeding management. When we think about, if you see advertisements and different things, and everybody's looking for the silver bullet or the magical substance that we can feed that steer heifer to make the next champion. And really and truly, there's no magic to it, okay? When we're talking about nutrition in your projects, it comes down to the science. We're going to talk about that. And then also the art of feeding, and that's the managing. And so when we think about it and we think about the science behind your steer heifer project, is the science is this particular sheet here. And what this says is the nutrient requirements for growing and finishing both steers and heifers. And so this nutrient requirement guide was developed by scientists. And you'll notice on this guide, I've got some things highlighted. But if you look at it, there's weight categories there. And so for the average 300-pound steer or heifer, at certain intakes, this is what we would expect them to gain. And we can see that they need a certain level of protein, and they need a certain level of energy, as well as their micronutrients, which is your calcium, phosphorus, salt, magnesium, copper, and so on with that. And then all the way you get into those micronutrients. And so this is the science behind the animal. Now, we know that, let's just say a 400-pound steer is going to need this many pounds of protein per day, and this many pounds of TDN and this much calcium and phosphorus to get a certain gain. Now, the challenge is that this is an average 400-pound steer per se. And what I mean that is, do we think that every 400-pound steer across the breeds, and even within a breed, let's just say within the Angus breed, is every 400-pound steer that's 6 months old going to perform the same and when you feed them the same amount of feed? And the answer is no. It doesn't happen in a feed yard. If we take a group of steers in a feed yard, and we may have a pen of 100 steers, and in that pen of 100 steers, you'll look and look, they're going to eat differently. Their rates of gain are going to be different. And the way that they will condition in fat will be different. Their metabolism is a little bit different. Now, there's subtle differences, just like in humans. You know, some of us are what we term easier fleshing than others. They put on weight a lot faster than humans. I've got a gentleman that, a good friend of the family, and he's about 6'2", and he looks like a beanpole. He's skinny as can be, and he eats all he wants. And so it's differences in metabolism between that. And so just like humans, that we have different metabolisms and so on, animals do the same way. And steers and heifers have differences as well. So the science, we know the average 400 or 500 or 1,000-pound steer is going to need this many pounds of feed for this amount of gain. But the challenge is that everyone's going to be a little different. And if you have a barn with 4 or 5 steers in it that you're feeding out for your project, they're all going to feed a little bit different with it. And that's where some of the art from the animal perspective comes into play, is the fact that we've got an average requirement, but we know that every animal is different, and we've got to learn how to read that animal. So that's what we're going to talk about on Thursday, is how to read that animal and the art behind it and to be able to manage it. The second half of the science is the feedstuffs. And what this sheet is, this is just a sheet of a lot of different commodities that we've got here. And we've got anything from alfalfa to rice bran to corn to whole cottonseed, just a whole wide variety of different things that is available that we can feed steers and heifers. The cool thing about cattle or bovine is that they have a rumen. And that rumen is responsible for taking and digesting the feedstuffs. A ruminant, or say a steer or heifer, they can take large quantities of low-quality substances like grass or some other high-fiber type substances. They can break that down into a nutrition for them. They also have the ability to take high-quality feedstuffs that are energy-dense, like corn or barley, some of these others, and they can break that down and digest it as well. The challenge is, when we think about the rumen in the stomach of a steer or a heifer, it is a living environment. The rumen is a fermentation vat, and it's filled with microbes, bacteria, and so on. And that bacteria has what we term a symbiotic relationship with the animal, with the steer or heifer. And if we alter that rumen environment, meaning we change feedstuffs dramatically, so we change from forage and automatically go over to straight corn, we can get into some challenges with acidosis, which is when we get the pH level within the rumen too low because of the digestibility. And then we can kill off that rumen bacteria. And then when you have that, you typically will see scours, maybe bloating, various different nutritional problems. And then those animals will take time to recover. And so when we get a problem like acidosis with it, because maybe we started them on too high of a quality diet, maybe too much corn in the diet, or we switch from a growing ration to a finishing ration too quickly, we get that acid, we get acidosis, and then we kill off that bacteria, and then it takes time. It's going to take you a week or 2 weeks to build that population back up to get that animal going again. And so it's important to think about that stomach of that steer or heifer. It's just like ours. If we go and we eat too much cheesecake or some kind of rich food, we'll get a bellyache. Same thing in cattle. If we change their diet dramatically, we can cause some problems. So the feedstuffs. And there's a lot of different commodities that we feed cattle on a daily basis. And so let's talk a little bit about these. And Kelly, I want you to help me out because we're going to ask for some of them to identify and text in what they think some of the commodities are that we're looking at. So we'll start off with this one if we can zoom in there. So if you would, text me and let me know what commodity that we have right here as far as our feed stuff. Kelly, when you get one, holler it out. Tell me what we've got.
We've got one that thinks it's cottonseed hulls.
Bingo, cottonseed hulls. And so cottonseed hulls are a roughage source for cattle. And when we think about cottonseed hulls, they're high in fiber, so over 50% fiber. They're very low in digestibility because they are very high in fiber. They're less than 5% crude protein, very little fat, very little energy in them. So we use a cottonseed hull in our diet. And you'll notice that most of your feeds will have some kind of cottonseed hull in them because it is a roughage source for that animal. And so we can't necessarily feed a steer or heifer straight corn or straight energy source. We've got to have some roughage in there to help protect the rumen with that. And that's what cottonseed hulls would do. Another option that we could have is we could feed this is chopped hay, is another roughage type source that you could feed to them. And oftentimes our feed yard diets, they will have some chopped alfalfa, or maybe they'll have some corn silage or something like that. But those are two roughage sources, not extremely high in nutrition, but they do have that roughage or scratch factor that is very important. The other thing that these two commodities do, that roughage source is, and today when we're looking at what the cattle will be expect out of both our steers and heifers, we're typically selecting for cattle that are really big in their middle, and so they've got a lot of rib shape to them. We talked about that in the selection. And one way the cattle get rib shape is we fill that rumen up. And so if you can continue to make them eat more and eat more of, say, a lower quality roughage source that doesn't digest as fast, one, it protects the rumen, but it also provides that bulk fill factor into it. And so in our barn, we'll feed our cattle quite a bit of cottonseed hulls, especially when we think about the heifers. We feed them a tremendous amount of cottonseed hulls, and I'll show you that here in just a minute. Let's come up with another one. Here's another one. So if you'll text in, what do we have here?
All right, it looks like someone thinks it's oats.
That's correct. So we've got some crimped oats there. And so oats are not quite as high energy as corn or barley, but they are fairly high in energy. They're a little bit higher in fiber, so they have a little bit more roughage source. And compared to corn, which is 9 or 10% protein, oats are going to be a little bit higher protein in that 12%. Oftentimes you'll see in some of your heifer diets, you may see them plug in more oats versus corn because it is a little higher protein, maybe not as high energy, so they don't tend to get as fat as easily with that. So a lot of your heifer rations, you may see some oats in there with them. A couple of other feeds. I don't have this one. So let's see if we can pick that up. Not gold nuggets.
A couple of folks saying corn, cracked corn.
Yeah, so we've got steam flake corn. And your corn will typically either be, will be processed most of the time in your show feeds. You don't have to process it. When I mean process it, either crack it or flake it. You can feed it whole. In some of our commercial steer programs, they will feed a whole shell corn because it's a little bit safer for the rumen. And they'll feed it with a premix as well as hay. But most of our show feeds, it's going to be processed. Most of the time, it'll be steam flaked. And that increases the digestibility of it. And it also makes it blend a little bit better as well. And so those are some of the commodities that we have. Some other things that we have in the barn. Let's see if we can get this one here. Looks delicious.
Got beet pulp coming in a few times.
Yeah, exactly. And so beet pulp, when we think about beet pulp, we use it for a filler. So it's high in fiber, definitely. And it's a good roughage source. So it's whatever's left over when they pull the sugar out of the sugar beets. And so you get the beet pulp. And so it is a good roughage source. One of the things that you'll see with beet pulp is if you put it in water, it will expand quite a bit. And it's the same thing when they eat it, it will begin to expand in their stomach and provide more fill with it. Sometimes we take that beet pulp and we've got a sink in here in the feed room and we'll mix it with some hot water and let it expand. And sometimes, just depending on the heifer, they may eat it wet and with that hot water better than they would dry. The thing with beet pulp, it is a roughage source, but most of the beet pulp that we get is going to have some molasses sprayed on it. And so it's going to have some sugar essentially sprayed on it. And so there is going to be some energy factor there. For us, we'll feed mainly some beet pulp as we get close to a show, but I typically don't like to feed beet pulp throughout the feeding period. If I maybe have a steer that's pretty green, needs some condition on, we may feed some beet pulp early on. Those cattle with that beet pulp, even though it's a roughage source, they can continue to put some condition on it. So we've got it. We'll typically start out a week before the show. We'll start really beginning to feed them quite a bit of that just to get that bulk fill and factor to them as well with that. Couple of feeds. So I think that's kind of all the commodities we have that we typically use. Here's a couple of feeds that we'll bring in front of you. And so if we look at these two feed stuffs. We'll do this. Didn't think about this before, so A and B. So we got two different feeds there. One's a finisher, considered a finisher, and one is going to be considered a grower. Can you guess which one's the starter grower and which one would be the finisher? Text it in, either A or B. What do we think? Which one's the finisher?
We've got a vote here that says B is the grower and A is the finisher.
Okay.
Another one that says A is the grower and B is the finisher.
Yep. So A is the grower. And if you'll notice, the B tends to have more corn in it. And you can see there's quite a bit of difference between the corn. And so there's about 3 or 4% more fiber, primarily cottonseed hulls, which you can see there, in the starter grower versus the finisher. There's also almost a 1% fat difference between these two, with the finisher having more fat in that product as well. So typically when we're starting cattle out, if they've never eaten any grain before, we're going to start them out with some hay, and we're going to start them out with this starter grower with that. Now, depending on the animal, in our barn, our heifers, we primarily feed them the starter grower, and that's kind of our base feed with that. Not real high in corn. It's got a lot of roughage factor to it as well. The steers, typically we'll start them on that starter grower, and they'll be on starter grower if they're going to the winter shows. So after the first of the year, most of the time the steers will stay on that starter grower until we get into September, when we finally start cooling off a little bit. And then we'll start changing them over into a finisher. Now, if I have one that's maybe a little later maturing, harder doing, then we may switch over. But those are kind of the two base feeds that we feed in our barn. One is a starter and grower, which is lower energy, and then one would be considered that finisher, which has got a little more corn and grain base to it. Now, we do, as we begin to progress into the feeding period, we get a couple of months before we need to start before we get to our end point, we may add some additional corn or most of the time we'll add some additional barley to that. And that additional barley we will either feed dry, or we can cook that product to make it even more digestible and appetizing for them as well. The key thing is you got to be real careful as you begin to add things to that particular diet or feed stuff that you've got. You can change some things. We can also add fat. Occasionally we will add some fat to them in the form of maybe just as simple as corn oil, or you can use some fat-based supplements. There's a number of those show supplements out there that are high in fat that you can increase the fat level. Challenge with fat is as I get my fat level above 5%, intake goes down. So this finisher feed is almost 4% fat. So if I take a total diet over 5%, intake is going to go down. So those steers are going to start eating less with that. So you got to be careful. I've heard war stories from, feed dealers and so on where, somebody's complaining about their particular feed is not, that their animals just won't eat very much of it. And then you ask them, what are you feeding those cattle? And what is your, and they may be feeding 2 or 3 different supplements that have different levels of fat in them, and that's altering the intake of those cattle. So that's kind of your basic feed commodities that we have. There's a number of different supplements out there that you can feed. I'll just kind of hit on those additional supplements. There's a number of different supplements. This is a Sun Glow product that they call Full Body. It's a pelleted ration with corn cobs in it, some alfalfa and some other things. Pelleted cottonseed hulls. So it's really just a pelleted roughage source, and it would be very similar to the hulls, but probably more nutrient dense there with that particular product. You can feed some of these different products like Full Tank, Big Barrel. There's a lot of them out there that are just really pelleted high fiber substances that as they get wet, they begin to swell and they begin to add additional fill to that animal. Number of other, another supplement that we use on our heifers, as they begin to reach kind of their condition point, we will start increasing the protein level in their diet. And we utilize that with a product. It's called Fitters 35 or Fitters 52. There's a number of those out there. The Femininity product is a product that's just high in protein. And essentially you bring the protein levels up in the diet of those animals and you begin to see some burning of that fat in there. Same time, you can't still feed them 25 pounds of your grain-based diet per day and feed them the protein source and expect them to slim up. It just doesn't work. You've got to change out and pull out the grain in the diet and really start plugging in the roughage source with that protein supplement. So those are some commodities. We don't use any really other special supplements. The only other thing we do is we just take a high calcium, low phosphorus mineral, and that's what this is. And we give them about that much per feeding. So it's a little extra mineral, a little extra salt, and that's kind of as detailed as we get it with our particular program. There are some mineral tubs, and some people put out mineral blocks and different things. And, those are all options. In the reality, if you're feeding a good, complete feed at the right level, they're going to get all the mineral and nutrients they need. It's just like us as humans taking a daily vitamin. We throw an extra little bit of mineral in there, and that helps to make sure they're meeting their dietary needs for calcium, phosphorus, and as well as your micronutrients like copper and selenium and so on. Now, minerals, you can get some toxicity in them. We know that sheep are very sensitive to copper. Cattle are not as sensitive, but I have seen scenarios where we did get copper toxicity in them. So be careful, don't overdo it, and too much of a good thing can be a bad thing with that. Now, the next question that I always get is, well, what brand of feed is the best? Okay, and for me, I don't get hung up on brands. You know, it really, the brand doesn't matter, okay? It's what's in the bag, and that's the most important thing. It doesn't have to be a pretty bag, but the key component of any good feed is that it's been balanced by a nutritionist, so it has everything that's needed for your show steer or heifer based on the feeding rate. And so it's balanced, but then two is that it's mixed thoroughly. And so each bag is just like the last bag. Sometimes you get into some feeds where you get one bag that's very dry, the next bag is solid as a brick because it's full of molasses. Molasses is sugar, and you can get some acidosis, especially as we're feeding our steers pretty hot rations. If we switch over to one with a lot of molasses, we can cause some scours and acidosis. So every bag needs to be the same, and that's a key component with it. The other thing is it needs to be fresh, okay? And it doesn't need to be sitting on the dock for months at a time before you pick it up. So you open the bag up and it smells stale or it's very dried out. So be careful with that. And you can get stale product from the small mom-pop operation, and you can get stale product from the big corporate mills as well. A lot of it depends on your dealer. If you're the only person feeding this particular brand of feed, and you don't work with your feed dealer and tell them how much you're feeding, they're going to get a bunch in, and it's going to sit there for a long period of time, and it may be 3 or 4 months old, and it may not be as fresh. So it's got to be fresh. So consistent product, it's got everything in it, and it needs to be fresh. The other one for me is that economical too. And because my family, the boys, feed quite a few steers and heifers out, anywhere from 7, 10, or 11 head at any given time, you know, we got to have some economics in it as well. And so, you know, it just depends on your situation. Now, in the video, you're probably seeing Producers Cooperative feed. Okay, this is not an advertisement for Producers Cooperative. It's the feed we feed here. It's the feed that my family grew up feeding over 30 years ago. And so it's the feed that we know how to feed, and it meets those criteria that I mentioned, and we're still able to feed it, be consistent, and the boys do well with their projects. Now, is there anything wrong with Purina? No, not at all. Or any of these others, Lenders or Sunglows, or Stanley Feeds, another local one, Nutrina. There's just a whole host of feed companies out there that produce good quality feed. You just got to find the feed that meets that criteria that I mentioned. You've got a readily available source that you make sure it's fresh and that you understand how to feed. So again, I'm not, you know, you see the co-op bags, but that's just what our family feeds, and we've always fed it, and it works for us. I've got friends, one of my best friends, they produce their local mill and they produce a good feed. And people say, well, why don't you buy from your best friend? Well, because I don't know how to feed that. And so, so it really doesn't matter the name on the bag, how pretty the bag is, it's what's in the bag and the quality of it as well. And so that's extremely important with that. As we move on and we talk about a couple other management considerations to think about as we begin to wrap up and we get into some questions on this particular segment. So we've talked about the different commodities, from your complete feeds, your starter grower, to your finisher, to your roughage source, the different sources of feeds that we have. There's a lot of different things out there. Now, we've got the feed. Now we just need to be able to manage it, okay? And the management is another key thing. And cattle are creatures of habit. They like consistency. And consistency is when you feed, okay? Most of us are going to feed twice a day. Some people like to feed once a day. I don't. I like to spread it out into 2 feedings, especially if you're really pushing and trying to get a lot of gain out of the calf. Some people, if you really need to get a lot of gain and trying to get volume in them, you split that feed up into 3 feedings. But most of the time, we're going to feed twice a day, and that's kind of what we do. So be consistent. If you consistently can feed at 6 a.m. and 5 or 6 p.m. in the afternoon, you need to stick with that. Now you may have to adjust that some. You may have to feed early as we move into the warm months. You may have to wait and feed somewhere closer to early in the morning, right before daylight at 6, but you may not be able to feed in the evening until we get into maybe 7 or closer to 8 o'clock, until we begin to cool off a little bit. And so those steers will eat a little bit better. And so be consistent when you feed. Don't just show up on the weekends and you sleep till noon, because when you do that, your steers are going to be out there waiting for you at the gate, and they're going to be frantic. And you say, well, they don't do that in the feed yards. Well, they do. They have set time schedules when they feed those cattle, and that's important to make sure that they don't get too hungry, and it's good for the rumen health and everything else. So a consistent schedule is very important. The other thing that is important is quantities, okay? And we're going to talk about how much to feed here in just a minute, but consistent quantities. One of the most important investments that you can put in your barn is a scale, okay? And it can be, this is a scale that we bought from a local feed store, and it works really well. You can hang a bucket on it. We've got it zeroed out. I think that scale was, no more than $40 or $50. It's very economical. We've had it for 7 years now. This is what the boys weigh and measure their feed at. You say, why don't we just dump it out? Okay. Well, most of the time you're not going to be very accurate. And as you begin to really push and feed, especially our steers, if we go over 2 pounds one day in a feeding, we may end up causing some acidosis. And so consistency is very important. And so in our barn, this scale is one of the most important things. And we think about, and it gets us so that we're very concise in our feed measurements with that. You say, well, why don't we just use a scale? Well, you can use or why not just use a scoop, okay? A scoop is fine. Growing up, we had a coffee can, a big coffee can, and that's what we used to measure feed. Well, how do you know how much a big coffee can weighs? Well, we were didn't have a lot of money back then, my family, and so we kind of did things the economical way. I took a scoop of the feed, I took a scoop of corn, I took a scoop of beet pulp, put it in paper bags, and I took it down to the local feed store that sold nails and seed, and they had a scale, and that's how we measured it. And so I knew how much that coffee can of feed weighed. I knew how much the hulls weighed and so on. When you feed in pounds, it becomes a little easier to interpret the feed and how much you're feeding. A scoop, this is the scoop we use, and it's a big scoop, okay? When I put that feed in there, we're looking at 4.5 pounds. That's the scoop that I scoop, if I scoop. My younger boy, that's probably about as much as he gets into it. And so if we look at that, his is about 2.5 pounds, okay? Same scoop, about 2 pounds difference in feed. Same thing. Differences also is as we get into different types of scoops. And so if you tell your ag teacher or your county extension agent or whoever's helping you, I'm feeding 3 scoops of feed per day or twice a day, well, 3 scoops at 4.5 pounds, we're looking at 13.5 pounds of feed. The little plastic scoops are typically 2 pounds, and they're going to be about 6 pounds of feed. So big differences. So that's where if you've got a scale, you can be a little more precise in what you do. And it can be a scale like this. I've got my nephews. They've got a couple of steers for their county fair. They use a fishing scale. It works just as well with that. So the scale is an essential component of it. And every feed that leaves this feed room is going to be measured in that bucket. And we'll make sure that we get those ingredients right for individually every calf. And so that's an important part of it. Another thing that's important as well is having some sort of way of keeping track of what you're feeding. If you've got, so my boys, myself, and the 2 boys, we typically the ones that are feeding and mixing feed. And so I can tell them what to feed, but the feeding also changes too. And it may change every couple of weeks. And so it's important to either have it wrote down, like we see here's a feed schedule here by weeks here. There's a couple of them here. We have a board. And this particular board's a dry erase board, and we went in and we marked off the different steers that we have on feed. And you can see we've got our heifers here, and we've got 1 steer here and 2 steers here. And we've got listed out. So this Hereford, cold Hereford steer gets 3.5 starter grower, 3.5 finisher, a 1/2 pound of full body as well. Whereas the heifers, we got 1 heifer that gets fed twice a day. These 3 heifers, they're mature heifers, so we're kind of holding on them right now. They only get fed once a day. But this particular board is a good way to make sure that everybody's on even playing field, and we know what that animal's going to get fed. So either write it down and have a clipboard with that sheet on there, or it can be a dry erase board. But that's very important to feed management. And so between the scale, having an understanding what these animals need, that's the important part of a feeding program. As we wrap up today and we kind of open it up for questions, I encourage you, a lot of times in this feeding thing, people try to make it too difficult, okay? It's really pretty simple. The science is, we know what an average animal needs. We know what is in this bag of feed and what the commodities are. But we know that we got to put some art with it. We got to begin to manage that. And the art comes into, here is the boys, and right now they've got 4 heifers and 5 heifers and 3 steers on feed right now. And you can see all of these buckets are totally different. The buckets on the end are primarily a lot of cottonseed hulls. And so we've got 3 fall-born heifers that'll be 2-year-olds this coming fall that are good condition now. We're trying to make sure that they don't put too much condition on before we get into the Junior Nationals show, which is going to be late in June, hopefully, in Abilene, Texas. We've got, here's one heifer that you can see there's not much feed in there. But this is a heifer that's a January heifer that we're day weaning. She's still on the cow, so she's only going to eat about 3.5 pounds of feed twice a day. Here's another heifer. So this is a year-old heifer that we got in that still needs some condition. She's got a lot of roughage in there, but she also has about 8 pounds of feed twice a day. So she gets that twice a day. And then we've got our steer feeds as well. And they're all a little bit different. We've got a smaller Angus and another one here. The cold Hereford's on half finisher and half grower because he's a little bit harder doing it. We think it's going to take a little more energy to get him to the point that he needs to be. So they're all a little bit different based on the stage of the production of that calf, okay? But consistency, making sure it's precise, and just the feeding management is so important to the success of the project. And like I said, right here, this is where our family, I think we really hinge a lot of our success is that the product that comes out of this feed room and goes to the calves there. Now, Thursday, we're going to go back into the barn, and we're going to spend some time looking at some cattle, talking about how do we manage performance on that live animal. How do you decide when to feed them once a day and primarily roughage, or when to feed them putting extra finisher on? How do you know how to do that? We're going to give you some tips and strategies with that. So that's kind of all the instruction we have for today. But Thursday at 3, we'll continue with this, and we'll leave it open for some questions. Kelly, do you have any questions?
Dr. Clear, we've got a few. The first one I have here is, will these videos be recorded and posted anywhere for people to watch later on?
Yes, they will. And they're going to be on the Texas 4-H Youth Livestock website. And we're working on the first 3 right now, kind of cleaning them up a little bit. and they will be posted and available there here within the next couple of days. So we'll keep you posted on that. We should be have those first 3 posted hopefully by Thursday, but we'll let you know Thursday.
Excellent. The next question we've got here is, when would you switch a January born calf to a finisher from the grower?
So if it's a heifer, typically we won't feed a heifer any finisher. We'll take those heifers and I'll feed them a higher quantity of a grower to try to get the energy up in them with that method. But we also increase the overall volume because we're trying on those heifers, give them as much middle as possible. If you've got a January born steer, a lot of it depends on your target, okay? If it's a January steer this year and you're trying to take it all the way around to Houston of next year, you know, you're going to spend most of the time, and you probably won't switch it over into finisher until we get into the fall. If that's a January steer and we're fixing to take him to the State Fair, Texas, coming up in the fall, you may begin to start putting them on finisher now. So typically we'll transition to finisher as we get 3 to 4 months out. Every animal's a little different. We'll talk about this as we move into Thursday about, you know, just because it's a steer, we're going to start it on finisher about 3 or 4 months out. We've had steers that have been on grower the entire time, and so it just depends. Good question.
Alrighty. We've got some individuals that would like to know if there's a need for a daily probiotic in their feed.
So, good question. Probiotics are just an added beneficial protozoa and bacteria that you add into the rumen. There is some data out there that shows that there is some value to doing that with those animals to maintain rumen health. The feed that we feed has got some added yeast into it, which helps, but it also has an ionophore in it, which helps for the rumen to be able to break down that feed stuff. So a lot of it, I think, comes down to your personal preference on that. But for us, our feed's got some yeast and different things in it, and so we don't add an additional ionophore to it. We'll throw in the small handful of mineral. This time of year, and we'll talk about this on when we start controlling parasites, but we feed a feed-through fly larvicide as well to try to keep our house and face and horn flies populations down on the cattle without having to use a lot of sprays. But very good question.
All right, we've got a couple of folks interested in where they can find the nutrition guide that you were using towards the beginning of the video.
Yeah, so you can go, and that's just the NRC requirements, and they may be a little too scientific for the average person because they're really designed for nutritionists that have spent his career in developing rations. But if you'll go and if you'll look at the NRC guidelines, it will have that as well as the commodity tables as well. So they're located online and very easily accessible. Good question.
All right, another question here. Is it important to keep your feed buckets clean, the buckets that you're using to mix the feed?
A very good question. So, and that's going to lead us into, and I'll ask this question, on the feed buckets, yes. You know, we don't necessarily go in and scrub our feed buckets after every feeding, but if you've got a steer or heifer that defecates in it or urinates in it, clean it out because they're not going to eat as well, and it's just not sanitary. So definitely, you know, wash them out. Don't let them get nasty or moldy or anything like that. That leads us into the next question, and I didn't really address this, but I'll ask this question to the group, and we'll see if somebody gets it right. What's the most essential nutrient that cattle need that they can't live very long without? What do they need?
We've got water coming in.
Yep, that's water. And so as you said, you know, we need to clean our feed troughs. That made me think about water. And good fresh water is really essential. especially as we're moving into the summer months now, when these projects will drink a lot of water. And so you've got to make sure you've got a good, clean water source. So for us, in our barn, we utilize those muck tubs that, really hold about 15, 20 gallons of water. That way we can make sure that every week we try to clean those out. And if for some reason the steer turns around and poops in it or whatever, we can easily clean that out. The other big beneficial part of that is we can monitor water intake as well. We can see that they're drinking, because that's a good indicator of that they're healthy as well. As we move into the summer months, you may get some cattle that'll drink over 15, close to 20 gallons of water a day. So you got to continuously replenish that water so that they've got good fresh water. So water is key, and you'll find that if you don't have good fresh water and they don't have adequate water intake, feed intake will drop and performance will drop. So I wanted to make sure that we address the water, because it is extremely important to it. Another commodity that we feed as well is, in addition to our feedstuffs, is every evening our cattle get some hay, and either grass hay or Sudan hay. And that's just an additional roughage and fill source for the rumen to provide that extra fill to keep the rumen healthy with that. Other questions? Good question on the cleaning feed pans.
We've got a couple of folks interested. Would you talk about how, if you let your heifers graze pasture as well as their roughage and feed?
Yeah, good question. So, for us with our projects, our traps don't have a lot of grass in them. So we're not accounting for that as far as the nutrient intake. But if where you turn your heifers out has been the last 2 months of great ryegrass and clover, that may be all that they need, and plus just a little bit of grain. If they're already in good condition, they could actually get very fat on some of that high quality forage. And so you've got to account for that forage that those heifers are eating with that. And if it's very lush and your heifers are in good shape, you may not have to feed as much grain with them. Same thing on hay. I get, advise some kids that say, well, your heifers are too fat. You really need to back off the feed. And they say, well, we're not feeding them any feed, but we got them on a round bale of hay. Hay can be 12 to 14% free protein and close to 60% TDN. And at that level, if you go back to our guidelines, a growing heifer can be gaining weight on that hay. And so for us, that's where we plug in when those heifers, we really need to try to restrict their nutrient intake. We want to keep the fill up. That's where we switch over to a cottonseed hull, which doesn't have very much nutrition in it, but it gives us that bulk factor to keep the middle on those heifers. Excellent question.
I do not see any more questions in the chat box at the moment. We will give it another couple of minutes.
All right. So if there's no more questions, and we'll have some time also on Thursday, but we'll wrap it up. Again, we're going to finish up the nutrition, how to read the cattle, and talk about some strategies there on Thursday and look at some cattle. But it was good to visit with you today. Again, we appreciate those extension agents that are part of the East Texas Show Star Series, as well as the extension agents that are involved with the Southern Classic and agents across the state. I know we're getting people in from around. And we also appreciate our 4-H livestock office, Mr. Billy Zanolini. Dr. Zanolini's been instrumental in helping us with the technology on this. As well as Kelly, we appreciate you stepping in for Dottie today and being our moderator. So with that, we thank you very much. You guys have a good afternoon, and we will see you on Thursday.